Vincent Marcello was a man built on the architecture of control. For 38 years, he'd ruled his corner of the city through calculation, precision, and the kind of quiet that makes men disappear. His reputation was currency, whispered in back rooms, written in the nervous glances of rivals, carried in the trembling silence of those who owed him. He was feared. He was respected. He was empty. Rosa worked the morning shift at Dante's Diner on 5th and Morton, a 12-hour graveyard of coffee runs and scattered eggs. She was invisible in the way only service workers truly are, present but unseen, heard but never listened to. At 42, with worn hands and tired eyes, she'd learned long ago that intelligence meant nothing when you poured coffee for men who thought your job defined your mind. When Vincent first came to the diner 3 months ago, he came because it was quiet and because Rosa never stared. He came to think, to count money that didn't need counting, to exist in a space where no one whispered. And one morning, when Rosa mentioned something about international markets during a casual comment about the news, Vincent mocked her, a cold, calculated dismissal designed to establish hierarchy, to remind her of the distance between them. It was cruelty dressed as humor. Rosa said nothing. She refilled his coffee. But on the morning of November 3rd, when Vincent felt the first warning sign, a tightness in his chest, a tremor in his left hand, he was sitting alone in that diner. By noon, he would be dying. By 3 o'clock, only Rosa would stand between Vincent Marcello and death. What neither of them knew was that Rosa's wasted intelligence would save not just his life, but his soul. Chapter 1. The Weight of Stillness. The rain had stopped an hour before dawn, leaving the city slick and gleaming under sodium lights. Vincent sat in his usual booth, corner, back to the wall, eyes on the door, and felt something shift inside his chest. Not pain, exactly. Something deeper, a loosening, like cables straining under weight finally beginning to fray. He'd survived 40 years in a business where men disappeared into rivers and parking structures. He'd survived rivals, betrayals, the weight of decisions that kept him awake in the dark hours before morning. He'd survived his wife's slow fade into cancer, his only son's refusal to take the family business, his daughter's deliberate distance. Survival was his native language. But this feeling, this sensation of something essential coming undone, was unfamiliar territory. Rosa appeared with the coffee pot before he could signal. She always knew. That was the thing about Rosa. She anticipated. She noticed details. She understood rhythm and consequence. Everything Vincent had dismissed in her was everything he suddenly needed. "You look pale," she said, setting the cup down with the kind of directness that only came from never being taken seriously. "You should eat something. The scrambled eggs are fresh." Vincent wanted to respond with the old dismissal, the practiced coldness that maintained distance. Instead, he nodded. The movement felt strange. His hand trembled slightly as he lifted the coffee cup. The diner hummed around them. The hiss of the espresso machine, the low murmur of 2 other customers near the counter, the distant sound of the city waking. Vincent had spent his entire life creating silence around himself, enforcing it through fear. Now, sitting in this ordinary morning in an ordinary diner, he felt the silence pressing inward, like pressure. Rosa returned with the eggs, toast, and fresh orange juice. Items he hadn't ordered. She knew his preferences better than he knew them himself. She set everything down with a precision that suggested care, though her expression remained neutral, professional, distant. "You're sure you're okay?" she asked, and there was something in her voice, not concern exactly, but a kind of attention that he'd learned to recognize but never fully acknowledge. She saw him. Not the reputation, not the machinery of control. Him. "I'm fine," he said, and the words felt like a lie even as he spoke them. But he wasn't fine. The tremor in his hand was growing, his chest felt compressed now, the breathing shallow. He told himself it was nothing. Stress, the weight of recent business, the approaching winter. He told himself to finish the eggs, drink the juice, pay the tab, and leave. Get back to the warehouse, call his consigliere, maintain the schedule. He picked up the fork. His hand wouldn't steady. Rosa noticed. Of course she noticed. She was already moving toward him, already reading the situation with the kind of clarity that comes from years of observing human beings in their unguarded moments. "I'm calling an ambulance," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "Don't be absurd," Vincent replied, but the words felt distant, echoing. "I'm fine." "No," Rosa said quietly, pulling out her phone. "You're not." And in that moment, as his vision began to blur and the diner tilted slightly, Vincent Marcello, who had spent his entire life making decisions, controlling outcomes, determining the fates of others, realized that his fate had just been placed in the hands of a waitress he'd never truly seen. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Invisibility. Before the collapse, before the ambulance, before everything changed, there was the question of who Rosa actually was. The answer, Vincent would later learn, revealed just how deeply he had failed to pay attention. Rosa had a master's degree in biochemistry. She'd spent 7 years working in a pharmaceutical laboratory before her husband's medical debt consumed their savings. Before the job market shifted and grants dried up and the weight of impossible expenses pressed down on every door she opened. She'd worked the diner for 12 years, not as a failure, but as a survival mechanism. It paid rent. It paid her mother's assisted living facility uptown. It didn't ask questions or demand more than she could give. She was, in fact, one of the most remarkable minds Vincent had ever encountered, and he had mocked her for pouring coffee. When the paramedics arrived, Rosa had called 911 before he could protest, had given them a detailed medical history he'd never shared with her, had mentioned his family history of cardiac disease with a precision that only came from listening. They found a man in the early stages of a massive heart attack. The paramedic would later say that calling the ambulance 5 minutes later would have meant death. 5 minutes. As they lifted him onto the stretcher, Vincent's eyes found Rosa's. She stood behind the counter in her faded apron, her hands steady, her expression unreadable. In that glance, he understood something he'd spent his whole life failing to see. Intelligence isn't displayed. It's lived. It's in the quiet competence of someone who notices that your blood pressure is likely elevated because your breathing is irregular. It's in the memory of 1,000 small details accumulated over months of careful observation. The ambulance moved through the city streets, the sirens wailing against the morning traffic. Vincent floated between consciousness and the strange lucidity of crisis, and in that half-aware state, he kept seeing Rosa's face, not as he'd dismissed her, as background, as service, as less, but as she actually was. He'd been wrong about everything. Chapter 3. The silence between heartbeats. The hospital became his new geography. St. Catherine's Cardiac Unit, Floor 4, Room 412. A space defined by monitors, by the mechanical sound of machines, by the strange choreography of nurses and doctors moving with practiced efficiency through the routines of survival. The heart attack had been severe. The doctors spoke in measured tones about percentages and percentiles, about blockages and interventions, about the narrow margin between catastrophic failure and recovery. Vincent's usual mechanisms of control were useless here. He couldn't negotiate with his own physiology. He couldn't intimidate his arteries into compliance. He could only lie in the hospital bed and face the reality of his own fragility. 3 days in, as the medication and the machines and the sheer exhaustion of survival began to settle, Vincent had a visitor. Not his daughter, who was in Florence and had sent flowers. Not his son, who was in Singapore and had sent an email. Not his lawyer or his business partner or any of the machinery of his former life. Rosa arrived at 4 in the afternoon, carrying a small container of homemade minestrone soup and moving with the quiet competence that had, he now understood, saved his life. "You shouldn't be here," he said, though what he meant was, "I don't deserve this." "I brought soup," Rosa replied, setting it on the table beside his bed. "The hospital food is garbage. You need actual nutrition if your body is going to rebuild the tissue around the damage." She said it as fact. Not kindly, not with forgiveness or absolution, just with the simple precision of someone who understands consequence and requirement. "Why are you here?" Vincent asked. And the question contained 1,000 other questions. Why did you save me? Why do you care? Why are you looking at me like I'm a human being when I've spent my entire life proving that I'm not? "Because," Rosa said, sitting beside his bed in the plastic chair, "you're alive, and that matters. Comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories of redemption and courage can travel." Chapter 4. The Fracture. Recovery was not linear. It was a series of small devastations followed by incremental gains. The medications made him dizzy. The physical therapy exhausted him. The cardiac rehab sessions forced him to confront the reality of his own mortality in rooms full of other damaged people. Some older, some younger, all of them facing the same truth that Vincent was only beginning to integrate. The body is fragile, and time is not infinite. Rosa visited 3 times a week. She brought food. She sat with him without pretense or performance. She talked about books she was reading, about her mother, about small observations of the city she'd accumulated over decades of careful watching. She never mentioned the mocking comment. She never demanded apology or acknowledgement. She simply existed in the space beside him like a quiet rebuke to every assumption he'd ever held about power and worth. It was this that broke him. Somewhere in the 3rd week, when the initial crisis had passed and Vincent faced the longer, slower crisis of having to reconstruct a life built on illusion, he asked her a question that had been accumulating weight since the ambulance. "What would I have to do to apologize?" Rosa was quiet for a long moment. She was looking out the window at the city beyond, at the November afternoon light, turning everything copper and gold. "You don't apologize to people like me," she said finally. "You just see us, and then you change how you live." This broke something open in Vincent that he hadn't known was locked. It wasn't emotion exactly. He'd spent too many years controlling emotion for it to arrive uncomplicated. It was recognition, a sudden, devastating understanding that his entire architecture of power had been built on systematic, deliberate blindness, and that this blindness had cost him not just respect, but the possibility of genuine connection with his family, with his city, with himself. "How do I do that?" he asked. "Start here," Rosa said, finally meeting his eyes. "Pay attention, really pay attention, to the people who've been visible all along." Chapter 5. The Weight of Seeing. By week 4, Vincent was home. A modest brownstone in the Italian neighborhood. The same place where he'd raised his children, where his wife had died 5 years ago. The house felt smaller now, or perhaps he simply felt exposed. The layers of defense stripped away by crisis and medication, and the strange vulnerability of recovery. He couldn't return to work. The doctors were explicit about this. No stress, no late nights, no business decisions that elevated his cortisol or strained his healing heart. The organization would continue without him. This was both a comfort and a devastation. His entire identity had been wrapped up in being essential, indispensable. the central node through which all power flowed. Without that, who was he? This was the question that haunted him through the rehabilitation weeks, through the physical therapy and the careful walking and the dietary restrictions that felt like punishments. This was the void that yawned open at 4 in the morning when sleep wouldn't come. On a Tuesday, 3 weeks after leaving the hospital, Vincent took a bus to Dante's diner, the first time traveling alone, the first time leaving his brownstone except for doctor's appointments. It felt extraordinary. The smell of the city, the sound of traffic, the weight of being visible in public space. Rosa was working the afternoon shift. She saw him arrive and her expression shifted, not dramatically, but with a kind of recognition that suggested she understood the cost of this small journey. "You're supposed to be resting," she said, pouring coffee before he'd even sat down. "I wanted to see where you are during the day," Vincent said, "to see your world, the one I never saw before." He spent 3 hours in that diner, watching Rosa work, watching how she moved with precision through the chaos of service, watching how she listened to regulars' problems, a divorced man's struggles with his teenage daughter, an elderly woman's grief over her husband's deterioration, a young couple's anxiety about medical debt. Rosa received all of it with the same quiet attention, the same sense that these stories mattered, that these lives contained weight and consequence. He watched her refuse a pass from a new manager who didn't know her history, who assumed that serving food meant availability. He watched her stand there calmly, without drama or performance, and simply say no. He watched her walk away and continue her shift with the same competence, undiminished. This was strength, not the violent kind, not the performative kind. The strength of someone who knows their own worth, regardless of how the world values them. By the time the evening shift arrived, Vincent understood something essential. He had spent his entire life confusing visibility with invisibility. The powerful, he'd believed, were the ones everyone noticed. But in fact, the truly visible people were the ones who saw clearly, who paid attention, who remembered details, who understood human consequence. People like Rosa, he was finally learning to see in return. Chapter 6. The Machinery of Change. The real work of redemption wasn't dramatic. It was small and daily, and mostly invisible to anyone watching from outside. It was Vincent showing up to Rosa's mother's assisted living facility with books, carefully selected based on Rosa's mention of her mother's love of gardening and history. It was him funding the pharmaceutical research position that had opened up at the university, using his business contacts to create an opportunity that would let Rosa work in the field she'd actually trained for. It was him sitting in recovery meetings, not for addiction, but for the addiction to control, to power, to the machinery of fear. It was him having conversations with his son about the family business, conversations that centered on the question, what do we actually want to build? Not empires, not legacies, not monuments to our own survival, but something that didn't require people to disappear, something built on actual value rather than fear. The transformation wasn't complete. Vincent was still the same man in essential ways, still deliberate, still careful, still someone who understood consequence and operated with precision. But the architecture had shifted. The purpose had changed. He was no longer building control. He was building something closer to connection. And it was Rosa who'd shown him how. She'd taken the position at the university, continuing to work the morning shift at the diner because it was hers, because she understood the regulars, because some people mattered to her. She and Vincent had become something like friends, a word that felt insufficient for what had actually developed between them, but it was the most honest language available. If this story already has your heart, hit the like button. It helps the story of Vincent and Rosa reach more people who still believe in compassion. Chapter 7. The Weight of Loyalty. But redemption doesn't exist in isolation. It exists in relationship to the world you've built. And Vincent's world didn't dissolve simply because he'd had an awakening. The organization continued. The machinery kept moving. And there were people in that machinery who hadn't changed, who saw Vincent's transformation as weakness, as opportunity. It started small, whispers that Vincent wasn't engaged anymore, that his decisions were being influenced by an outsider, that his heart condition had made him soft. Within 2 months, there was a move to consolidate power, to shift control to someone more willing to operate in the old way. Vincent's second in command, a man named Carmine, who'd been with him for 20 years, made his choice clear: return to the business or lose everything. Vincent sat in his living room one evening and weighed the choice. Go back, reclaim control, prove that he was still powerful, still essential, still the man who couldn't be questioned, or hold the line, lose the business that had defined him, risk becoming nothing. He called Rosa. "I don't know how to exist without the power," he told her over coffee at the diner, late on a Tuesday evening when they were alone. "It's like being asked to breathe underwater." "You're breathing now," Rosa said. "You've been breathing for 2 months without that machinery. You're still here. You're still alive." "But I have nothing." "You have your daughter. You have your son. You have your health. You have clarity. You have a life where you can actually see people." Rosa leaned forward. "That's not nothing. That's everything." The decision, when it came, was simpler than he expected. Vincent held a meeting with Carmine and the other senior members of the organization. He announced that he was stepping back, not retiring. That was impossible. The machinery didn't work that way. But stepping into a different role, advisory, limited, gradually moving toward dissolution. They thought he was serious. The shock that followed when he actually meant it was its own kind of power. Chapter 8. The Mirror of Consequence. What Vincent didn't anticipate was the clarity that comes from genuinely seeing your own damage reflected in the world. With his attention no longer consumed by the machinery of control, he began to understand the actual reach of his legacy, the families that had been destroyed, the systems of fear he'd helped construct, the violence that had rippled outward from his decisions, whether he'd ordered it directly or simply allowed it to happen. This recognition didn't come with dramatic revelation. It came through conversations. Through the elderly man Rosa knew from the diner, a retired mechanic whose son had been killed in a territorial dispute involving Vincent's organization. Through research. Through the systematic confrontation of truth that he'd spent his entire life avoiding. The work of actual redemption, not the redemption of feeling better about yourself, but the redemption of trying to repair genuine damage, took months, years probably, though Vincent's weakened heart meant he wouldn't have years. It meant working with Rosa to establish a fund for families damaged by his organization. It meant facilitating the transition of the business to people who might run it differently. It meant testimony to law enforcement, careful and controlled, that dismantled pieces of the machinery without destroying everything. Rosa never asked him to do this, but he could feel her watching, feel her taking inventory of whether he was actually changing or simply performing redemption differently. The real test came one evening when a young man arrived at Vincent's door. The son of a rival Vincent had destroyed 20 years ago. The young man's hands were shaking. His intentions, based on the genealogy of violence, should have been clear. But Vincent invited him in, made him tea, listened to his story, and when the young man revealed that he'd come not to kill, but to understand how someone like Vincent lived with what he'd done, something closed and healed within Vincent simultaneously. This was the actual mirror of consequence, not judgment, not punishment. Simply the full humanity of someone claiming their own story back from the machinery that had tried to erase it. "I don't know how to answer that," Vincent told him. "I'm still learning to live with it." "What helps?" the young man asked. Seeing people clearly, Vincent said, really seeing them, and then choosing to do less harm instead of more. It wasn't absolution, but it was honest. Chapter 9. The Light Before Dawn. Vincent died on a Tuesday 9 months after his heart attack. It came quietly in his sleep, in the brownstone where he'd raised his family and then learned to live differently. Rosa was not with him. His daughter was, sitting bedside in the quiet hours after midnight. But when the sun rose and the city began its waking, it was Rosa who understood first that something essential had shifted. His daughter called her before she called anyone else. This alone suggested how completely Vincent's world had been remade. The funeral was strange. People came who shouldn't have known each other. His business associates, yes, but also Rosa, her mother, the regulars from the diner, the young man whose father Vincent had destroyed, the families of the fund Vincent had created. They stood together in a space that contained Vincent's contradictions without attempting to resolve them. He had been a dangerous man. He had become, in his limited way, a better one. Both things were true. Rosa didn't speak at the service, but she stood afterward and told his daughter something that made her cry. Your father learned to see people. That's the rarest thing. That's what he chose to do with the time he had left. In the weeks after, as the machinery finally began to fully dissolve, Rosa returned to the diner. She worked mornings and taught biochemistry 3 afternoons a week. She carried Vincent's attention with her, the way he'd learned finally to really see people. And when new regulars arrived, when invisible people sat down with their problems and their fears and their small human stories, Rosa listened with the clarity of someone who understood that intelligence lives in attention, that power means nothing against compassion, and that redemption is measured not in grand gestures, but in the daily choice to see clearly and act with mercy. The diner hummed around her. The hiss of the espresso machine, the murmur of morning traffic, the sound of ordinary people living their ordinary lives. But in that ordinariness was the extraordinary fact of genuine attention, of being truly seen, of the kind of strength that comes not from control, but from presence. In a coffee cup on the diner's back shelf, Rosa kept a photograph. Vincent at his brownstone, smiling, not the careful, calibrated smile of a powerful man, but a genuine smile, uncertain and real. Below it, in Vincent's handwriting, a single line: She taught me to see. Subscribe for more stories of loyalty, forgiveness, and redemption. Thank you for watching the case of Mafia boss mocked the waitress's intelligence. She saved his entire life in just critical minutes. See you in the next one.